Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Well, I'm here tonight because I belong to a group that has rather dubious historical origins. Early practitioners of my tradition claim to have supernatural powers, and they also claim to have access to knowledge, esoteric knowledge that was only granted to the worthy. And as a result, they communicated their messages in the form of cryptic allegorical parables in order to hide that knowledge from the uninitiated. These early adherents to the tradition were persecuted and marginalized before eventually gaining acceptance in the wider world. And I'm, of course, talking about my heritage as a chemist. Perhaps you were thinking I was talking about something else, but in fact I'm talking about chemistry because chemistry has its historical origins in a field known as alchemy. And early alchemists believed that by contemplating certain philosophical ideals, things like beauty and truth and reason, you could come to understand the things that we now describe as chemicals. Likewise, alchemists believed that by examining chemicals, you could actually come into a greater understanding of these higher philosophical truths. So for example here, Maria Prophetissima was an alchemist from the 3rd century in North Africa. She described the first apparatus for the distillation of compounds, and she also claimed to be able to use that apparatus to extract precious metals from plants. This is Jabir ibn Hayyan, an 8th century alchemist. He presented the first purification of citric acid and then also talked about how molecules crystallized to form solids. And then later on in his work, he also claimed to be able to synthesize scorpions and snakes out of inanimate matter. This is Roger Bacon. He's famous from the 13th century in England for presenting the first Western recipe for gunpowder. Also, he presented the first Western recipe for turning lead into gold. And then finally, Paracelsus, 16th century alchemist. He's the father of modern toxicology, and he arrived at many of his conclusions by drawing from his extensive experience in astrology, namely observing the motions of the planets and inferring how those motions of the planets were going to affect the action of chemicals in the human body. So historically, it may seem strange to the modern mind that alchemy and chemistry grew up together. But then again, if we think about the paradigm for a chemist, it's someone who wears a funny coat and mixes chemicals inside of strange containers. And if we think of the paradigm for an alchemist, it's also someone who wears a funny coat and mixes chemicals in strange containers. It's just that this person's a wizard and this person's a chemist. Now, it took many centuries for the discipline of chemistry to disentangle itself from the spurious influences of alchemy. Now, I am also a Christian, and the historical narrative of Christianity is eerily similar to that of chemistry. Historically, religion has had to work to disentangle itself from mythology on the one hand and superstition on the other. Now, mythology is the practice of inventing fictional tales in order to explain material events for which we have no satisfactory explanation. So in order to explain how humans discovered fire, you invent a fictional character named Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and was later punished for his arrogance. Superstition, on the other hand, is belief that one type of event causes another type of event through some supernatural intermediate. So one superstition that's very important for today is the superstition about 4-leaf clovers. If you discover a 4-leaf clover, the superstition says it will bring you good luck. Right, we all know that superstition. And so reason and experimentation have historically been very important tools by which we expunge mythology and superstition from religious thought and practice. So for example, by scientific investigation, we can explain how early humans discovered fire without invoking bearded deities. And we can also test what happens after people find a 4-leaf clover. Do they actually have good luck? What if we genetically modify the clover to overexpress the 4-leaf mutation? Are they still lucky? What about if I discover a 5-leaf clover? Is that even more lucky? If so, what about 6? How does the amount of luck scale with the number of additional leaves? These are the kinds of things science can do for us. It helps us to expunge errors. But the question then becomes, after applying the scalpel of scientific investigation to religious thought, is there anything left? Or is it all just mythology and superstition? And in particular tonight, I want us to talk about miracles. What role should or could miracles play in religious faith? What does science say about the possibility or the probability of miracles happening? And so to start with, we need to define what a miracle is. And so I'm going to propose the following working definition for miracles. I'm going to define a miracle as a significant action by a supernatural agent within the natural order. Okay, so I think this is just a working definition, but I think it captures what I think are the three most important things about a miracle. First of all, it involves a supernatural agent. So that might be God, that might be Allah, that might be Vishnu, that might be Zeus. It needs to be observable within the natural order, so I have to be able to tell that something happened, and it needs to be significant. Now, I want to note that by this definition, a miracle does not have to violate any of the laws of nature. You could, for example, have a miraculous prophecy or a miraculous military victory. A miracle doesn't have to abrogate the natural order, but since I'm a scientist and we're here talking about miracles and science and faith and these kinds of things, the real question is, okay, fine. A miracle doesn't have to break a natural law, but could it? Could a miracle violate the laws of nature? And so, does science allow that, or does it not? Has science explained away all miracles that appear to violate the laws of nature, and has it expunged them in the same way it has expunged superstition and mythology from the lexicon? Or considering it from the other side, if science does allow for miracles, how do we explain and reconcile those miracles with the apparently inviolable natural laws? Well, first, I want to point out that miracles are different in nature than either myths or superstitions. You see, myths are explanatory. They exist to explain natural, historical, or cultural events in terms of some fictional supernatural backstory, and they often incorporate some moral lesson. So miracles are not explanatory. In fact, quite the opposite. Miracles are usually identified specifically because they are hard to explain. Thus, when we read of the Israelites finding manna in the desert, it is a miracle account and not a myth, because it does not explain some phenomena we are familiar with, but rather introduces us to something that is unfamiliar. Miracles are also different from superstitions. Superstitions give reproducible cause and effect relationships between natural events that invoke some supernatural entity. So superstition tells us that every single time you find a four-leaf clover, it will bring you good luck. That's why superstitions are testable. Miracles are, by their nature, irreproducible, because they involve the intervention of a supernatural agent who, by definition, since it's supernatural, is an agent we cannot control. So when Jesus walked on the water, it was a miracle, because try as I might, I have been unable to reproduce that phenomenon in my own experience. And if you decide to go out and try that phenomenon yourself, I have one suggestion for you, which is you should learn to swim first, because it is not reproducible. Now, most religions claim at least, so now within this definition of miracles, we can talk about them because most religions claim at least some miraculous events. Christianity is no different. I would hazard to say that you can't really believe in Christianity without believing in at least some miracles. Maybe only a few, but some. And so the question becomes, does science eliminate the possibility of miracles? Well, to put it bluntly, the answer to this question is no. Science does not disprove, rule out, or eliminate the possibility of miracles, but I want to expand on that and explain why that's the case. So science finds its basis in reproducibility. So a typical scientific observation might be something like, when mixed together, potassium and water produce a vigorous chemical reaction. I wouldn't suggest doing that reaction because it's very, very vigorous. But in saying that, I might be reporting something that I only saw one time. But if I'm saying that in a scientific context, the implication is that that observation is reproducible. So that if I did it again, I took some more potassium and some more water and I mixed them together, I would get another vigorous reaction. And the implication is that if you did the reaction, you would get the same vigorous result. And that if I assigned this to a bunch of students in chemistry lab, they should all get the same result. This reproducibility is the central tenet of science. It's why we can use science to design bridges that don't fall down. It's why we can use science to design cars that protect you in the event of a crash. Reproducibility is what has made science universally accepted. But the requirement of reproducibility also makes science incapable of proving or disproving a miracle because, as we said, miracles are irreproducible. A miracle is something that happened one time in one place under one set of circumstances. However, unlike the reaction of potassium with water, we are unable to reproduce the miraculous results. Now, there is a misconception out there that what science actually does is proves that irreproducible things don't happen. Now, if this were true, this would certainly rule out miracles. It would say that everything that seemed to be irreproducible would be wrong. But any practicing scientist will tell you that modern science actually shows us that there are lots of irreproducible things out there. So take, for example, data like this. So here I'm plotting some observable A as a function of some variable B. And there's a little bit of scatter in the data here, but I think there's a pretty clear conclusion, so I'm going to give you guys a pop quiz. So how many of you, looking at this data, would say that observable A depends on B? Not many, maybe a couple. Okay, how many of you would say that observable A does not depend on B? Okay, we got a lot more people. I agree with the majority here. If I saw this data, my scientific conclusion would be A does not depend on B. Now, if that's the case, if we agree that A doesn't depend on B, how do we interpret that point? I've got my trend that A doesn't depend on B. It's this value. And then at this point, it's way, 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 way up here. What's going on there? Well, I have another quiz for you. So I'm going to give you now 3 choices about how we're going to interpret things. So option 1 is, OK, I'm going to stick with the law. The law tells me that A does not depend on B. Thus, the data at point X have been fabricated. Okay, it cannot possibly, this can't possibly be right because A doesn't depend on B. Option 2 is because A changes near point X, it's constant, 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 up and then back down, we conclude that actually the situation is that A depends very, 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 very sensitively on B. And then I'll give you the escape of saying if you don't like either of those, then you can go with none of the above. All right, so how many people are going to go with 1? How many people with 2? We got a few people with 2. How many people with 3? Okay, the majority say 3. That would be my guess too, if I saw data like this. It's not as if, so number 1 basically says we believe the law and we believe it so strongly that we deny the data. And that's not the way that we approach things in science. The data exists. That's the data. I took it. It came out to that value. I'm not allowed to throw out data points that I don't like. Likewise, the law is correct even though the data don't unanimously support my conclusion. They overwhelmingly support it, but it's not unanimous. And this is in part because, as a scientist, when I see a point like this, my natural assumption is to assume that that point is probably not reproducible. So that if I ran this same experiment or observation again, I might see data like this. So there's some green points here. And you'll note that for the green points, the things that are reproducible are the points where A does not depend on B. The ones where A has these huge outlier effects are the ones that are irreproducible. And so we see results like this in experiments all the time. Things that are irreproducible, and what do? We ignore them. Okay? We call them outliers or noise or experimental error or uncertainty. We basically make up reasons why it could have turned out this way, and then we ignore the irreproducible events in favor of the reproducible parts. Now, there's a common philosophical extension of these ideas, and I'll call it the completeness hypothesis. The reasoning goes as follows. It says, well, yes, it sure seems like there are irreproducible events, things science can't explain, but that is really just a reflection of the incompleteness of scientific knowledge. Everything that today looks irreproducible is actually part of a larger reproducible pattern that we just don't understand yet. So that's my completeness hypothesis. Now, some people will try to pass this hypothesis off as a scientific conclusion. It is not a conclusion. It is not derived from experimental results. It is rather a very strong statement of faith in science. It's based on assumed knowledge about how future experiments will turn out. It's the assumption that they will all turn out to be reproducible eventually. And it's not at all clear that that assumption is correct, because future experiments indeed could discover that everything's reproducible, but they could also reveal new ways that nature is fundamentally irreproducible. You see, one of the great scientific discoveries of the 20th century was the discovery of the inherent uncertainty of scientific observations. So I study quantum mechanics, and so I'll bring in an example from that, which is that the laws of quantum mechanics, for example, dictate that there are certain situations where you can set up precisely the same experiment, and I mean precisely the same experiment. And you can run that experiment many times and obtain irreproducible results. For example, you could prepare many identical particles and send them through a detector, and that detector could be designed to flash either red or green, depending on the spin of that particle. And you prepare the particles in identical ways, and you pass one through, and it flashes green. And then you pass the next particle, the exact same particle, exact same state, you pass it through, it might flash red. And then the next one goes through, it might be green again, and then green, and then green, and then red, red, green, red, green, red, red, green, green, red, red. The results are not reproducible, even though you're performing the same measurement on exactly the same system. And quantum mechanics tells us that this is a fundamental facet of nature, that there are measurements that are irreproducible. Now, miracles are not typically quantum mechanical, so these observations aren't directly relevant to the question of miracles. But they are relevant to this completeness hypothesis, because quantum mechanics proves that science does not imply that everything will eventually become reproducible. You can practice science, you can work science, and you can still believe that a given event is irreproducible. And sometimes quantum mechanics says you will actually be right, for sure. And other times you're just inferring things. So this is a big leap of faith. It's not a necessary component of scientific thought. And because of this, science does not rule out miracles in any way. So according to science, miracles could technically happen. But have they happened? Have we ever seen a miracle? Because I don't go around saying that every irreproducible event is a miracle. If one of my students turns in a lab report and claims he got 115% yield on his chemical reaction, I don't call it a miracle. I call that a mistake. So how do we decide if a miracle has occurred? Well, I propose that there are three things we should ask when examining a potential miracle. So the first question we ask is, did something happen? Because here we must admit that the vast majority of accounts of incredible miracles are actually fakes. People who are reporting things that never happened, either to get attention or to cover up the truth. You hear people say things like, I saw Jesus in my bowl of Cheerios this morning. Or, Bigfoot is the father of my baby. These are not miracles, they are fabrications. Nothing actually happened. The second thing we have to ask is, if something did happen, is there a simpler explanation than calling it a miracle? Because even if we grant that something happened, it could just be a coincidence that's not really that improbable, like finding a parking spot. So we could attribute it to coincidence, or we could find a simpler cause for the events, and therefore sort of deduct from the probability that this is a miracle. And finally, we have to ask about the significance of the event. Because there are lots of insignificant, irreproducible events. I do experiments, I get weird results, I do those experiments 100 more times, and I never get that weird result again. That's not a miracle, because I'm, by assumption, thinking that there needs to be some significance here if we're going to attribute it to a supernatural cause. God isn't going around messing about with the natural order because he's bored. If he or she, for that matter, does something, there must be a reason why he or she did it. So we have a framework here for deciding if something is a miracle. Let's apply this to the emblematic miracle in Christianity, the proposed resurrection of Christ. Was that a miracle? Well, first thing I need to ask is, did something happen? Well, I think as a historical event, there is not much scholarly debate on this point. Something happened. Something that made the early disciples at least believe they had witnessed the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. To make the case that the accounts are a fabrication requires some rather questionable historical analysis. So something happened. The second question, is there a simpler explanation? Okay, well, this is where the resurrection is harder to justify because it's not hard to imagine a simpler explanation. In fact, pretty much any explanation would be simpler than he rose from the dead. And so this is where the debate actually happens. Now, of course, any potential explanation would have to square with the data that we have. It would have to explain how a band of uneducated local tradesmen constructed a coherent theology of an omnipotent God made flesh. It would have to explain what made them traverse 3 continents by land and sea, spreading that message. It would have to explain what made them willing to become martyrs for that cause. And it's difficult to come up with a perfect alternative that is a simpler explanation. But this is where the intellectual questions really lie. Is there a simple explanation, and if so, what could it be? Because then you can get to the final question. You say, well, is there significance to the event, enough significance that we might want to attribute this to the action of some supernatural agent? And this is kind of a gimme for the resurrection. If it actually happened, if Christ was actually raised from the dead, it was very significant. It was a sign that his teaching was divine, and it was also a significant element of who he claimed to be. He claimed to be the one who would bring victory over death. So in this case, deciding whether the resurrection was a miracle or not hinges on point number 2, whether there's a simpler explanation or not. Now, unfortunately, there is very little real scholarly work done that uses this kind of analysis to investigate miracles. And I think part of this hinges on the fact that to most academics, miracles are inherently implausible. The consensus seems to be that, yes, we can talk about these strange events that are reported to have happened 2,000 years ago, but ever since science came along, we just don't see evidence of miracles anymore. So, the idea seems to be that if I plot the frequency of miracles in Christianity as a function of time, it looks something like this. So frequency of miracles, time. And this is not to scale. But the consensus seems to be that, there were a lot of miracles back here in the olden days, maybe some blips here in the times of the prophets. There was a big spike in miracles around Jesus, and then we live out here where there's nothing. Okay, so there's no more miracles, they're all gone. If this is the data, isn't it more plausible that miracles are absent today? Is it more plausible to say miracles are absent today, but they were really common in the past, or they're absent today because they've always been absent? Writing for The New Yorker, Adam Gropnik, I think, summarized this viewpoint pretty concisely. He said, we know that in the billions of years of the universe existence, there is no evidence of a single miraculous intercession with the laws of nature. Now, I think Adam was overstating his case a little bit by implying that we've been observing the universe for billions of years. But he gets the gist. Which is that the prevalent view among academics is that we've been watching closely for at least 100 years. And in those 100 years, no evidence of a miraculous intercession with the laws of nature. Yes, there might be things that science cannot explain, but there's nothing that looks truly miraculous. And so I want to tell a story. So this is my son, Peter. And when he was 3 months old, Peter started having some health problems. So the first thing we noticed were some small purplish red marks appearing on his body. So you can see some of them here on his elbow. You can see them a little bit better here on his leg. He also had some bloody noses, but it was a rash, some bloody noses. It didn't seem like a big deal. Then he had a blood vessel burst in his eye, and then his gums started bleeding. And that started to make us concerned. And as it turns out, these small spots aren't a rash. They are actually tiny bruises, known as petechiae. And the problem was that Peter's blood was not clotting properly because he had no platelets. And so we took him to the hospital, and they ran several dozen blood tests on him. They ran ultrasounds. They did a bone marrow draw. And what they discovered was that he had an autoimmune condition known as Evans syndrome. And for the pre-meds out there, Evans is the coexistence of autoimmune hemolytic anemia and idiopathic thrombocytopenia. For the non-pre-meds out there, Peter's immune system was identifying his platelets and his red blood cells as germs, and it was killing them off. And so as a result, he was both dangerously anemic and prone to bleed or bruise as a result of the slightest injury. So that was bad, but the worst news was this. So Peter was fortunate enough to be at Children's Hospital in Boston, which is the premier children's hospital in the world. And as a result, our attending physician estimated that they probably saw something like 50% of the domestic pediatric Evans cases, of all the pediatric Evans cases, at one point or another. So they knew a lot about it, and the unfortunate news that they had for us is that there is no cure for Evans syndrome. They were confident they could manage his symptoms, they could prolong his life, but he would always be sick. And so we prayed. We prayed that God would make him well. We asked our friends to pray for a miracle. Now, no miracle was immediately forthcoming. And so in the meantime, we started Peter on immune suppressants to treat his symptoms, and they worked. His symptoms got better. So here's a picture of him from that time when he looks well. So his immune system is still malfunctioning here in this picture, but the symptoms are suppressed. He looks pretty good. And then at the next monthly checkup, something strange happened. They ran his blood test, and he passed. And me being the skeptical scientist that I am, I thought, well, that's only one test. And the lab tech could very easily have screwed up the test. And plus, he's on immune suppressants right now, which is very likely going to screw up the test that measures his immune response. So, just as the doctors recommended that we wean him off the medication to see if he could stabilize, so we weaned him off, and we waited a few months, and we gave him another blood test, and he passed again. And this is a picture of Peter when he was 1. This is his big sister over here. This is a picture of Peter when he was 2, helping to shovel snow. We do a lot of that in Boston. This is a picture of him when he's 3, having a drink with his dad. This is a picture of him from just last week at his 4th birthday party. They had a pirate theme. And I show you these pictures because they give Peter a blood test every year. And every year he passes. Peter was sick. We prayed. He got better. Now, there is evidence here to suggest it was a miracle. I have photos, eyewitness testimony, lab results. You may or may not think there is enough evidence to call it a miracle, but to say, as Adam Grofnik says, that there is no evidence of a single miraculous intercession with the laws of nature is false. There is evidence for this. There's also evidence for thousands of other contemporary miracles. Now, these miracles are of a different type than the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. They're less important, perhaps, than the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, but they exist. This plot is, in fact, not correct. Now, it's important to realize from this that science is not eradicating miracles. Indeed, in Peter's case, the only reason I believe it was a miracle is because of what I know about science. If I didn't know anything about science, I would have just observed Peter got sick, he got better, big deal. Kids get sick and get better every day. The only reason I thought it was unusual was because I knew that he had an autoimmune condition for which there is no cure. We knew enough to say that if the data for Evans syndrome looked like this, that point is Peter. The increase in scientific knowledge does not eliminate or marginalize miracles. It actually gives us opportunities to recognize them. But to me, while the modern evidence for modern miracles is not conclusive, the existence of that evidence certainly increases the plausibility of ancient miracle claims. Okay, so miracles are possible within the confines of science. We might even imagine circumstances where a miracle might be plausible. But can we ever be sure? How can we be certain that a miracle has occurred? Can we ever be certain, in fact, that a miracle has occurred? Well, purely based on science, if you want to say, can we ever be certain? The answer is no. We will never be certain a miracle has occurred using just science, but by the same token, we can never be scientifically certain that a miracle has not occurred. Because contrary to popular belief, science does not, by itself, lead us to certainty. As Richard Feynman once, it may give us greater and greater confidence in a proposition, but that's not the same as certainty. Richard Feynman once said that in science, we have found it of paramount importance that in order to progress, we must recognize ignorance and leave room for doubt. Scientific knowledge is a body of statements of varying degrees of certainty, some most unsure, some nearly sure, but none absolutely certain. Because even for a theory with no known exceptions, in science we must always be wary. Wary that when more data comes in, the model might turn out to be wrong. And classical mechanics will give way to quantum mechanics, and Newton will be replaced by Einstein. And so there's no such thing as scientific certainty. It's a myth. In life, we never have certainty just based on science. But in life, we do obtain certainty. We just obtain it through a different criterion. And to illustrate that criterion, I have a little parable for you. So suppose we have a friend, Sally, here. And Sally is out hiking. And she is very hungry because she ate all her trail mix a couple of miles back. She's still several hours from base camp. And she notices that across a deep valley, there is a plate of bacon. And while science and miracles are not either or, bacon is definitely either or. Either you like bacon or you're wrong. And so Sally is really hungry, and she really wants the bacon. But unfortunately, she can't hike to the other side of the valley. It's too far to jump, and the canyon walls are too steep to hike down. Luckily, she notices that there's this bridge. Now, she has to decide if she is going to cross the bridge or not. And it's a pretty sleazy-looking bridge. It's missing a couple slats. It's got this very thin rope holding it together that's starting to fray in a couple of places. It sways every time the wind blows. Will the bridge hold Sally if she attempts to cross, or will it collapse under her weight, leaving her to plunge to her death? She may think the bridge will hold her, but how can she be certain? Well, the bridge by itself gives the ultimate test of certainty, because if Sally attempts to cross the bridge, I contend that it indicates she is certain the bridge is going to hold her. Because unless she is suicidal, she'd have no motivation to step on the bridge she thought would not support her. Likewise, if she chooses not to cross the bridge, it means she is not certain that the bridge will hold her. And ultimately, I think this is the key measure of certainty. Our certainty, or our lack thereof, is ultimately tested by the decisions that we make. Certainty is certainty to act. So in getting on the plane to come here, I expressed my certainty that that plane would not crash. In marrying my wife, I did that in part because I have certainty that she loves me. On the other side of things, I have yet to buy my daughter a pet because she is only 7, and despite her promises to the contrary, I am not certain that she will remember to feed that pet. And so this is our working definition of certainty. Certainty is certainty to act. And in order to have that kind of certainty requires faith. Because we've seen that science can give us greater and greater confidence in a proposition, but it never gets us all the way across the gap from indecision to certainty. So, maybe Sally's a mechanical engineer and she estimates that the bridge will probably hold her weight. She might be pretty confident, but she's not going to be sure. And so getting to that last step, bridging that last gap between what science tells us and certainty, there's always a gap there. It might be big, it might be small, but there's a gap. And crossing that gap requires a step of faith. Now, this need not be religious faith. We can have faith in the goodness of humanity, faith in a person, or even faith in the law of gravity. But making decisions requires faith, because faith is the thing that gives us certainty. If I want to state it mathematically, evidence by itself is not equal to certainty, but evidence combined with faith is equal to certainty. And the thing about life is it forces us to do more than just contemplate evidence. It forces us to act, to make decisions. And those decisions express our faith, whatever that faith is. So take a particular potential miracle, like the story of Peter being healed. I'm certain myself that it was a miracle. But that does not mean that I have no doubts. I think, maybe it's even though I can't find an explanation and the doctors can't see an explanation, maybe there is one that we just can't see. Or even if there isn't an explanation, maybe it's complicated, but it's all just a big coincidence. I have doubts, but certainty is not the absence of doubts. Certainty is certainty to act. I have certainty because I'm willing to act. I'm willing to say, I think this was a miracle. It's a simple action in this case. Sometimes the actions are more complicated. But when someone says that believing in miracles requires faith, that is what they mean. They mean that you can gather all the scientific evidence you want, but ultimately being certain that it either was or was not a miracle requires faith. Not faith to ignore doubts, not faith to ignore evidence, but faith simply to act like you witnessed a miracle. Because the one thing miracles do is they change you. In particular, they make you want to talk. I have a hard time imagining anyone who would witness a supernatural event right before their eyes and not turn to the person next to them and say, "Guess what I just saw?" It's our natural human response. And so getting to that point of being willing to say, okay, I believe this is a miracle only insofar as I'm willing to act upon that knowledge, that is the kind of certainty that we can have in miracles. And so finally, I want to talk about the last point in this talk, which is that Okay, suppose that you've gone this whole distance. You've said, okay, miracles are possible in science. Maybe I found a miracle that I think is even plausible based on evidence, and I'm willing to invest a little bit of faith to say that I believe this was some type of a supernatural, miraculous event. So what? What are we going to make of a miracle like that? What kind of evidence does a miracle provide? What should it prove to us? And this is an important question for Christianity because by my estimate, Christianity, more for better or for worse, relies more on miracles than any other world religion. So if you read the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, he spends roughly 1/3 to maybe even 1/2 of his time working miracles, healing people, casting out demons, providing food where there was none. Miracles were clearly very important evidence to early Christians, evidence so important that it needed to be documented extensively. So what kind of evidence are miracles? What should they convince us of? Well, first, I should emphasize what miracles should not do to us. Miracles should not convince us of things that our reason and conscience tell us are false. So miracles are often referred to as quote-unquote signs and wonders, things that confirm the authenticity of a message. And this is true, but the key word here is confirm. That is to say, the message was something the listener independently might be inclined to believe, and the miracle brings a reinforcement of that belief. So when Jesus taught, love your neighbor as yourself, that was a message that his audience might have been inclined to believe, and any miracles that would attend that would have been intended to confirm that belief. If by contrast Jesus had said, thou shalt rob the Quickie Mart, then there would be no miracle that could confirm that message to his audience because they had a presupposed knowledge that you're not supposed to rob the Quickie Mart. So what kinds of beliefs might miracles confirm? Well, in the Christian worldview, miracles teach us about God. Put it bluntly, you can have God with no miracles, but you can't have miracles with no God. And in Christianity, we look at the reproducible events we catalog in science. We look at the motion of the celestial bodies. We look at the organization of living things. We look at the delicate structures of molecules. And these bits of evidence, these things teach us about a God who ordered the natural world, set up the natural laws, and ordained them to function. A God who works through those laws to animate the universe and to sustain life in it. Christianity finds evidence for the character of God in those reproducible things. But it also finds meaning in the apparently miraculous occurrences that science can't explain. And the amazing events that freed the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt, or in the apparent resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. In modern accounts of healing and also in modern accounts of healing and deliverance. In these events, we confirm a belief, we take these as evidence that God cares not just about physics and chemistry, but also about people, about alleviating human suffering, about justice. It teaches us that God is a God who wants to reveal himself to us. So that's the kind of evidence that miracles are. It's evidence that confirms and gives us insight into the nature of God. But in that sense, miracles are of a similar nature to the evidence that we get out of scientific inquiry. Both of these things give us information about the way that God is. And so I hope I've answered some of your questions about miracles here. No doubt you have more. You have more questions about miracles, so I'm looking forward to our Q&A time. Please, during the Q&A, ask me whatever is the burning question on your heart, even if it seems really, really tough. I'm going to say there's only one topic in the area of miracles that's off limits to me. I don't want to talk about Tim Tebow. A lot of people think that he works miracles or did work miracles. I don't really want to talk about that. Other than that, anything you want to talk about, I'm happy to talk about. Thanks. Questions? Hi.
My name is Adam Woodward. I'm here with the Graduate Christian Fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious about your definition of science having to do with things that are strictly reproducible. I like that definition. I think it's a good working definition. But what about fields such as paleontology or evolutionary biology or other realms of rational inquiry that don't really deal with events in the past that by nature can't be?
That's a great question. So could everybody hear that, or do you want me to repeat? I'll repeat just in case. So the question was, I used this definition of reproducibility as being the basis of science. So what about things like paleontology, evolutionary biology, where some of these same kinds of things they're not like chemistry, or like the reaction of potassium with water. You can't reproduce them because they deal a lot with historical events. I would say that even in those fields, the other thing I would add to that is cosmology or astronomy. I can't do laboratory experiments on the planets because I can't make them do what I want. They kind of do what they want. But even in those fields, there is still reproducibility. There's two kinds of reproducibility in science. I've mainly given examples of experimental reproducibility, where I can set up the same experiment and run it twice. That's true, for example, of physics and chemistry and most of biology. But there are other fields like paleontology or cosmology or evolutionary biology where there's a different kind of reproducibility, which is observational reproducibility. In other words, going through the historical record week of astronomical observations, we can see that Halley's Comet comes back every 76 years. And so that's a kind of reproducibility that allows us to make predictions and allows us to test mechanisms. So there does need to be some kind of reproducibility, even in observational science, for it to be science and not just observations. Does that make sense? OK. Other questions? I like questions, and I'm not mean. Yeah.
Hey, I have a question. I'm Daniel.
Hi, Daniel.
I'm just here for fun. So built into your definition of miracles is that they are significant actions.
Yes.
And you talk a lot about miracles that have personal significance to you, and you claimed at one point that there must be a reason for miracles. But you also described in your quantum mechanics example something that is seemingly a miracle, but that seemingly has no significance. So the green and red particles spinning in different directions. So my question for you is, what do we do with those kinds of occurrences that we cannot comprehend in terms of significance, but that are miraculous in accordance with everything else that you described?
Right. So so that's a very good question. So I'll repeat it just in case there are people who couldn't hear. So the question was, I gave the example from quantum mechanics where things turn out green, red, red, green. It's very difficult for me to attribute significance to that, and yet it has all the other hallmarks of being miraculous. So how do I actually deal with that, or what do I actually derive from that? Well, so that quantum mechanical example is actually the reason that I would append the word significant to the definition, because it looks to all other purposes like a miracle, but I don't generally think of that as being miraculous. One of the things that does come out of that quantum mechanical example is there's this huge philosophical debate in quantum mechanics about whether the universe. There's a huge philosophical debate about that, but basically it boils down to this. Is the universe closed? In other words, is everything within the universe affected only by things within the universe, or is it open? Because for quantum mechanics, it has a great deal of importance for specifically that kind of measurement. So that kind of measurement is indicative of an open quantum mechanical system, whereas if it's a closed quantum mechanical system, everything becomes predictable again. And so to everything we can do, it looks like these experiments are fundamentally irreproducible and unpredictable, which would suggest, although it doesn't prove, it would suggest that the universe is actually open. So that there is something outside of the natural order that or at least what we normally call the natural order, that interacts with the natural order. Now that may not be supernatural, it may just be like other natural interacting with our natural, but it suggests there is something else outside of the universe. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Okay, so I guess I'm just a little unclear on how you're defining certainty.
Yes.
Yeah, because like you gave the example of when you took the airplane to get here.
Yes.
I guess how I would look at that is I'm not certain that the plane isn't going to crash, but like it's unlikely enough that I'm most likely getting more out of flying, like compared to the probability of a crash. And so like I'm guessing, but I think that flying is a better guess than not flying. Is that?
I'll clarify. So what I'm saying, of course, is that. So I gave this in the example of miracles, but that I think the Enlightenment has forced a definition of certainty on us, which is that certainty is the absence of doubt. And that definition of certainty, I don't think they realized it at the time, but that only applies in mathematics. That's the only area where you can actually eradicate all doubt. And so they've enforced this definition of certainty that is completely useless, except for in math class.
I know, I teach a math class.
Yeah, so I was a math major also as an undergrad, so I know so I know what a little bit of what I'm speaking of. So, but the thing is that definition of certainty has sort of crept along to where that's what everybody sort of says, right? But the word certainty predates the Enlightenment, and you have to go back and say, well, what did it mean before that? And so certainty was a kind of conviction, and it was conviction to act. And certainly when that idea is used in sort of any type of early Christian context, it was used in this sense. It was not, and I say this only because I think there is a misconception that somehow people of faith are sort of like stick their fingers in their ears to they're like, I'm going to be certain because I'm just going to, I don't want to hear anything that might cause me to doubt. And that's not a healthy attitude for anyone, Christians included. And so all I'm trying to point out there is that, yes, there are certain things that you maybe intellectually have doubts about or not. And then there are points where you have to make a decision. And then there are various ways that you can make that decision. But the plane example is a good one because you can say that you're playing the odds, right? Which is that, okay, it's 99.9% sure that the plane won't crash, and that's worth the error. But if it crashes, it definitely wasn't worth it, right? So it's either 100% worth it or 100% not. And so you have to make an either-or decision, and it's not like the decision is 99.9% worth it. It's either 100% or 0. And so I think we give ourselves the illusion that probabilities matter to individuals, but probabilities don't matter to me. So it was 1 in a million that Peter would get Evans syndrome, but he got it. And so the probability that it was not going to happen didn't end up mattering. So in practice and decisions we can weigh the probabilities, but the probabilities aren't what actually affects us. Like I don't experience the mean result. I experience what I experience, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just wondering, since you talked about your son and his sickness, like obviously it seems kind of random the people that get sick, and how do you go about talking about like, okay, well my son isn't sick anymore, but what about this other
Yep.
with Evans syndrome? Why is he still sick?
Mm-hmm.
Those kinds of ideas. How do you kind of approach that with the idea that, well, what happened with my son is a miracle, but there are miracles that are not happening for others?
Yep. So again, the question here was, how do I reconcile the fact that, okay, there was this, this thing that I would ascribe to being a miracle with my son, but there are other kids with Evans syndrome who were not being miraculously healed. And maybe some of them are Christians, maybe some of them are also praying, and they're not being healed. I could go that far and say, why was it? And so this actually was an argument that for me, I must openly confess that when he was sick, I did not think he was going to get better. We prayed, but I didn't think it was going to happen because I had exactly this logic of why should God make me special? In particular, we're sitting on the pediatric hematology floor at Children's Hospital, and we see, dozens and dozens of kids with these, really incurable, horrible diseases. And I'm like, why would God single me out as being special and leave all these other kids sick? And so I was like, so I don't see any reason why God would do that, so I don't think it's going to happen. At the same time, I'm sort of in a catch-22 where I did pray it anyway, and it did happen, and so I can't I can't pray it and then say, well, but I don't really think it was, God. In terms of why God, heals one person, he doesn't heal another person, that's certainly a difficulty because it's, I can't explain, because I could also even cast that in the sense of, yes, God healed him, but God's also the one who gave him Evans syndrome to begin with, or allowed it to happen. And that was actually, a struggle when he was sick. I'm like, God, why did you let this happen? And this all, I think, gets back to the Christian response to the problem of suffering, which is, there are lots of people who are suffering. Some of them seem to be delivered from it, other ones don't. How could a good God allow this? And ultimately, the Christian response to suffering does in part play out in this world. So there are sometimes miraculous deliverances from things, but ultimately our response to suffering as Christians is that this world is only a part of the story, that the ultimate story actually involves things that are going on outside of this world. And that whatever is unjust here will eventually be made just. Whatever suffering is incurred here will eventually be compensated or explained at some later point. And to some extent, the miracles are sort of the foretaste of that, of us saying, okay, look, there's a God who is powerful enough to overcome these things, and someday it will happen. One day. And so in that sense, I feel like Christianity gives a great deal of hope to us in the midst of suffering, even though nobody, not Christians, not non-Christians, not Buddhists, not Muslims, has a complete understanding of how these things work and why they work that way. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
Kind of dovetail off that. I think it's kind of interesting because then in the definition, something that's implicit is that miracles are something positive, right?
It can, so.
I mean, it could meet all of those other criteria.
Yes, so there certainly is the possibility of negative miracles. You very rarely hear people talk about, miraculous defeats. It's like, oh, God miraculously came in and made me, trip and break my arm or something like that. But yes, I mean, implicit but this actually is a biblical idea that the same God who does these wonderful miraculous things is also the same God who can do terrible miraculous things. And one of the words that the Bible uses to describe the proper reaction towards God is fear. And it's not servile fear, like, oh, I don't want God to punish me. It's just this fear that God's this huge, powerful, awesome thing, and I don't know exactly what he's going to do. We have some sense, I mean, there's plenty of scriptural evidence that ultimately God works for the good, that he is a good God, but that doesn't mean that it's going to look good to me right now. That, whatever looks good to me might actually, what looks bad to me might actually be good in some grander scheme. And in particular, it might be bad for me if I was working against the good purposes, even if I didn't know that. So there certainly are situations where you could say, look, God could intervene miraculously, and it could turn out looking really bad for somebody. Yeah. Yeah.
So, about miracles themselves, so would you agree that for a miracle to be a miracle, especially in biblical times and now, that, for example, Jesus, he healed a deaf man, or he healed leprosy, and yet in today's world, there's no scientific or medical healings that happen. So, can a miracle could be classified as something that previously there was no evidence or certainty for it, and now there was. Now, in the future, say for example, like the deaf can be healed,
Mm-hmm.
or leprosy can be healed, would it still be considered a miracle?
Right.
What's your comment?
Right. So there's, I think, so the question I would sort of phrase there is, so the question was, so there were examples of Jesus doing miracles where sort of the deaf were able to hear or leprosy was cleansed, and at present we describe those as miracles because we have no understanding of how that could happen. And so suppose at a future date we actually did figure out a way to cure leprosy or make deaf people able to hear. So now there's one extra wrinkle I have to put into that, which is that in order for it to really explain the miracles that Jesus did, we have to do it the same way. Right? So we can't use really high-level technology and cochlear implants to heal deafness and say, aha, see, we can heal the deaf. It wasn't a miracle when Jesus did it, because he didn't have a cochlear implant. So we would have to figure out some mechanism by which we could do it that was plausible using first century AD technology, which makes it a bit harder, but it's still not, it's still it's a hypothetical question. So we can hypothetically say, we figure out a way that you can cure leprosy using first century technology. Would this mean it wasn't a miracle? So I tried at the beginning to be careful to say that I don't, so there are certain people who would say that miracles have to violate the laws of nature. I don't agree with that definition. It's the important part of miraculous experiences for tonight that we discuss the miracles that might violate the laws of nature. But certainly there are miracles where you could say, all right, I could come up with some mechanistic explanation at a later date, but if that mechanistic explanation was sufficiently implausible, that it's like, so if it's like, yes, Jesus figured out a way to heal the deaf in first century, and like 3,000 years later, 2,000 years later, we figure out a way to do it, so that there's, it's not violating the law of nature. Still, there would be the question of, well, how did Jesus figure that out? He was just alone by himself in Palestine, and he figured out how to heal the deaf. That seems rather improbable and implausible. And so there would still be the question of where did he get that information? And so it's still very possible to say, well, here's something that does not violate the laws of nature, that we have a mechanistic explanation for, but that still appears to be miraculous. The sort of I think the push towards describing miracles as things that violate the laws of nature is mainly driven by philosophers who want to sort of have a different kind of philosophical discussion about this. But I think the Judeo-Christian tradition actually, biblically, there are a number of things that are described as miracles that actually have mechanistic explanations. So the most famous example of this is the parting of the Red Sea. So how many of you guys think that Moses going in and saying, "Let my people go," and then striking the Red Sea, and then the waters part, and the Israelites walk through, and then the Egyptians walk in and the waters collapse, and they drown the Egyptians. How many of you guys think that was a miracle, or would be a miracle if it happened? Okay. It's interesting because the Bible actually provides a scientific mechanism for how this happened. So in the verses right before this parting of the Red Sea, it says that overnight the east wind blew very strongly and blew back the waters in the Red Sea. So it gives us, if the wind blows strong enough, it can blow the water out, it can, push the water out of the way. Mechanistic. Yeah, sure, it's improbable that you would have an east wind that was that strong, but it could happen. For me as a scientist, I often want to be able to test everything scientifically, like run a control experiment and a regular experiment. I empathize with that. And the unfortunate truth is that it's not just this issue. There are lots of issues in my life where I can't run a control experiment. And so this is one of those. You don't have a control experiment where you can say, okay, what if I do it this way? What if I do it this way? And so this is to some extent the reason that I say, okay, well, in order to make a decision on this, you do have to place faith in something. So you might place your faith in saying, I see so much reproducibility in the world, I'm just going to place my faith that everything is going to be reproducible. It just seems the most likely or satisfying or spiritually gratifying or mentally gratifying to me. Or you might say, okay, well, I see all of these things in terms of the teachings of Christianity and how successful it's been. I'm going to place my bets there of saying, okay, this has a really holistic worldview that doesn't really conflict with any of the science, so I'll place my bet there. You could also do the same thing with Islam, for example. You could say, I'm going to take this Islamic worldview, it's the most compelling to me, and go in that direction. In terms of whether those are testable or not, it's not as if there are no tests. There aren't the kinds of tests that I would do as a scientist for these things. So there is historical evidence, and you can analyze that, and certainly some of the claims of Christianity, while they're not falsifiable, they are, I'm going to invent a word here, I'm going to say they're implausifiable. So you can prove that they're probably not true. And so there is some amount of testing that you can do there, and I think there is good scholarship on those things of people who are honestly trying to say, look, are these things plausible or not? There is also testing, though, that goes on not just on things that happened a long time ago, but in the present day, which is that there are corollaries of things in Christian teaching or Muslim teaching or in the things that science would have us do that say, okay, well, if this is true, then something will occur in my life. So, Jesus has teachings, and you can test those teachings. He says, things like, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. That's there's some wiggle room in that statement. But at the same time, does that actually happen? Or it says, blessed are you who are poor in spirit, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you who are pure in heart, for you will see God. Is there any sense in which being pure in heart actually gives you some sense of the presence of God? If those things end up not being true, and you can test those a little bit with action, then you have reason to say, well, maybe the antecedents of that argument are also not true. So it's a kind of testing, but it's not hypothesis, control experiment, testing. It's more along the lines of, there's wiggle room here, but you can at least test plausibility, I think. Does that sort of help a little? Okay, good. Other questions? Yeah?
So I noticed throughout your talk that you were very considerate when you were speaking about people who are not Christians, and you made sure to accommodate your structure of miracles with all different kinds of belief systems. And as a non-believer myself, I really appreciated that. So thank you for that, certainly. But I'm also curious to hear, just from your personal experience as a Christian believer, how do you reconcile your religion and your understanding of religion with the reality of religious pluralism and spiritual pluralism?
Yes. So can I? That's a very good question. Can I ask a follow-up question to refine it so I make sure I answer it? Are you worried about pluralism between different religions or within the Christian viewpoint?
No, I was thinking between different.
Okay, good. All right. So certainly, I've thought a fair bit about this. I can't say that I've examined all world religions with an equal hand or anything. I wouldn't say anything as ridiculous as that. I actually wanted to talk about, this is actually, I should say, this is the first time I've given a talk about miracles specifically in this kind of a context. So this was like all new material. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it is because this is something that I think is distinguishing about Christianity. I mentioned that I think Christianity, in my understanding of the other world religions, Christianity relies more on miracles than other world religions do. So if you compare to Islam, for example, it's questionable whether Islam relies on miracles at all. So the Prophet Muhammad was very careful to say that, somebody asked him why he doesn't do miracles, and he didn't say, oh, but I do. He said, the only miracle that you need is the Quran. Now, there are various hadith that come on afterwards that attribute miracles to Muhammad, but they are not foundational. The Quran is the foundation. Any miracles are kind of like, okay, well, they're additional. So miracles are not as important in Islam. They're not as important, at least in the modern practice of Judaism, to the understanding it's much more of a Jewish culture and the history of the Jewish people. That's the central thing. Miracle accounts are somewhat less important. And then you can take a look at, so those are sort of the monotheistic ones. You can take a look at the Eastern religions, and actually in Buddhism, for example, there really isn't a concept of a miracle because there isn't really a concept of supernatural. Like, it's almost the natural religion. So anyway, that's why I wanted to look at miracles, because I felt like it was distinguishing in terms of those different religious worldviews. Because I think one of the things that, I'm going to refresh just so you guys aren't looking at my screensaver here. Just a minute, I think I can. There we go, okay. Because there are distinguishing features for the different religions. It's not as if they're all more or less equal. It's just, you choose your favorite. There are good reasons to think that one religion is maybe, for example, as a scientist, I am very concerned about whether a particular religion is consistent with scientific practice. And there are certain Eastern religions that are not consistent with scientific practice, that have a superstitious view of the natural world, where there are spiritual forces and agents that work in the natural world in ways that are claimed to be reproducible, but in fact are not. And so that would be very problematic for me. If I had a religious viewpoint that said things were going to happen one way, and they didn't happen in that way, that would be, a pretty big existential crisis. So I guess I should say there. So it's not. So there is pluralism. I don't think that all the viewpoints are really apples to apples comparisons. I think the study of religion is really comparing things. As Western people, we like to call religion, one field, but different religions are really quite different in terms of how they approach things. Now, in terms of pluralism, I think. And part of that factors into the pluralism piece, because it's the one thing that does stand out about Christianity to me, that's the other sort of convincing thing in terms of the sort of marketplace of ideas things, is if something really was true, if one of these religions really was true, you'd expect that to be able to transmit across cultural lines, across history, across national borders, and those kinds of things. And of the world religions, there are really only two that have done that. So Buddhism has transmitted very successfully across cultural lines and across national lines in Christianity. Islam has not really been very successful at that. Judaism has not been very successful at that. Hinduism has not been very successful at that. They're very culturally constrained religious traditions. And so in the sense of pluralism, to some extent, I see the pluralism as saying, well, there are some more, cultural belief systems that don't transmit across cultural borders, and there might be a reason for that. And so that the things that do transmit across cultures, that's also a vote in favor of saying, well, there might be some kernel of truth here that causes them to transmit between different people. Yeah. Other questions?
So what would you say about pluralism within Christianity then?
About right. So so the question is, what about polarization within Christianity? I find it quite embarrassing. Because as Christians, we pride ourselves of saying, we have one faith, and there's one gospel and one God, and we cannot seem to agree for more than about 20 seconds. I belong to a tradition actually that is possibly one of the most embarrassing on this. The church that I go to, they seem to split over just about anything. Now our church looks back and we're like, this is kind of embarrassing, really, that they're clearly not God-centered splits. They're clearly people-centered splits, at least in our church tradition. In other cases, it's theological differences and so forth. And so the polarization that I see in the church of people sort of trying to get away from one another by making their own little burrows. That aspect of it I find embarrassing because it's not the way that the body of Christ is supposed to behave. And we all know this, and yet we all behave this way. And this is, I think, one of the other things about the Christian worldview that resonates for me, which is that the Christian worldview is a worldview of a kingdom that is and is not yet. So we have a vision of a kingdom that is coming. We're trying to make that kingdom present here, but it isn't here yet. And I think that is very consistent with my experience as a human being, that there are very often things that I want to do, that I expect to do, and that I think I should do, and I can't quite seem to make myself do them. And Christianity, I think, has the intellectual space where it gives us a justification for that, an explanation both for why we would expect ourselves to behave a certain way and also why we would not be able to behave in that way. So the polarization in that sense, does embarrass me. There is one sense in which the pluralism is, I think, reflective, which is the pluralism within the church that has to do with the fact that, okay, well, if I went to church in Atlanta, it would probably be somewhat different than the church in Boston, which would be somewhat different than the church in London, which would be different than the church in Nairobi, which would be different than the church in Hong Kong. There is a sense in which the sort of pluralism in the church is actually a reflection of the diversity of the worshipers. So they're all people worshiping the same God in their own idiosyncratic ways. And to that extent, I think the pluralism is helpful because it helps us to discover more things about people's interaction with God. As long as it's pluralism that's inclusive as opposed to exclusive pluralism, which we are actually, there's both of those things happening in the church these days. Other questions? Yeah.
Would you say because of the not being able to reproduce certain things within evolutionary biology, it seems like we kind of say that as an assumption. Would you say because of that, and if we're going to take that as an assumption, that evolutionary biology is altogether like outside the realm of science in a sense, and more of a philosophy?
So the question is, because there are things that are irreproducible in evolutionary biology, would we say that this is outside the realm of science? So I would not say that. So I would say, it depends where you're going to draw your line. But my definition of science in terms of reproducibility is mainly focused on the natural sciences. And evolutionary biology typically falls within the natural sciences because they attempt to pick out the things that are reproducible. So they'll look at the different species and try to figure out the things that are reproducible. They'll try to do a phylogenetic analysis. Now, the real difference between evolutionary biology, say, in physics on one hand and physics on the other is that the data in physics is really high quality. Like you can get really, really high reproducibility in physics. The data in evolutionary biology is comparatively poor. It is more difficult to obtain reproducibility. There are larger gaps in the data, and that's just the nature of the system that is being studied. Now, does that mean that evolutionary biology is not science and that physics is? No, I think evolutionary biology still is science. It's just that we need to acknowledge that, okay, well, the data here is not as strong. It doesn't mean that they're not approaching it scientifically. It doesn't mean that there's not something that's learned here. It doesn't mean that there's not some reproducibility there. But we do just need to acknowledge, okay, look, the data here doesn't have quite as much reproducible character as experiments on gravity, for example. Is that what you're getting at there? Okay. Yeah.
Would you say that a belief in miracles cuts off your opportunity for scientific inquiry? Because I think, like, if you look at the example of your son,
Yep.
to say it's a miracle, that potentially could close off an opportunity to investigate that, find out if that could be reproduced for other people. And I think in science, that's something you hear a lot, that a belief in God is kind of a cop-out that cuts off scientific inquiry.
Right. So again, I'll just reflect the question back. So that was, does belief in miracles sort of close off certain avenues of scientific inquiry? Because once we say this is a miracle, stop investigating it. And certainly, I think that's the wrong attitude to take about miracles. Because if it turns, the doctors have talked to us, and it's entirely possible that when Peter is older, they will ask him if he's willing to participate in some studies to try to figure out if there was some mechanistic reason that he was able to recover from this when other kids have not. And if that and I would absolutely support, I mean, it's going to be his choice, not mine, but I would actually absolutely support him if he wanted to do that, because I would, if there's a material cause, I want to know what it is, and particularly I want to know what it is because I would love for other kids to be able to be cured. And so my statement that I am certain it was a miracle, this is important why I say I still have doubts, because I still would like to have those doubts answered. I would like to know one way or another whether those doubts are right. I'm going to, in the meantime, proceed saying that it's a miracle until I find out otherwise. And even if I find out that there's a mechanism, like say he has some particular genetic mutation that made him, able to reset his immune system when other kids can't do that, that would still be pretty miraculous to me. And I would still be pretty grateful that he had that genetic mutation. So I'm not afraid of any discovery that would give some scientific mechanism to it. I don't see one, and the doctors don't see one right now. But even if we found one, that's part of the reality of the situation. I certainly don't want to call something a miracle and close my eyes and say it's a miracle. Stop telling me it's not. And I guess actually a little bit of insight into my character, that when he passed his first blood test, I told you I didn't believe it was a miracle. And when he passed his second blood test, I didn't believe it either. And the person who first decided that it was a miracle was his doctor. She sort of looked at his test results and she was like, I don't know, maybe God healed him. And so at that point I felt convicted that I'm like, okay, well, fine, okay. So I do have doubts and I do want them to be worked out and answered, and I don't have any fear over either possible answer to those doubts. Does that make sense? And so I guess, so the idea that something's a miracle should not ever preclude scientific investigation of that. So for example, for the resurrection of Christ, if I believe that's a miracle, I should not say, and therefore stop doing all this historical scholarship to find out if it really happened. Because it was a miracle, gosh darn it, stop looking. We should want the historical scholarship, because if I really believe it's a miracle, you should be able to really converge that historical scholarship down to the finest point and not find something that proves it wrong. Yeah. Oh, there's two, so I'll back one and then front. Yeah.
I'm just curious about whether you have any insight or thoughts about not just the question of can a scientist believe in miracles, but the process of humans ascribing meaning to miracles.
Yes.
Interpreting them maybe as having a purpose or as something. I'm just very curious about that.
Right. So the question was, I did a lot of talking about the possibility of or plausibility of miracles, but then what about the process of ascribing meaning to them? And I had some that I had said about that, but I was going to run over time, so I shortened the talk and removed that. So the fundamental difference between the way that we ascribe meaning to things and the way that science operates is that ascribing meaning to something is subjective, whereas science is concerned with objective truth. And now the words objective and subjective are actually misused nowadays. So many of you probably don't understand what I mean, because subjective is used as an insult. So if somebody evaluates you poorly, you'll say, oh, but that was so subjective. It was just a subjective evaluation, by which you mean it was wrong. And if someone is behaving in a way that you don't like, they're saying things that you don't like, you'll just say, please, can you think about this objectively, by which you mean stop being so stupid. So objective is good, subjective is bad. Now that's the popular way we use the words. That's not the actual definitions of the words. So objective truth is truth that exists independent of the subject. So scientific truth is objective because it's supposed to be the same truth whether I observe it or you observe it or you observe it or you observe it, same truth. Subjective truth is truth that also influences the subject in some fashion or other. Scientific truth is always objective because the observation is out here and the observer is over here, and that observation is not supposed to affect me. I'm not supposed to affect the observation either. We're just supposed to be independent. Subjective truth is something that affects me. It's something that changes me. And so anything from which I derive meaning is subjectively true. So that doesn't mean it's false or it's relative or it's made up or it's bad. It just means it affects me. And unfortunately, that's something that's always outside of science. Now, how do we arrive at subjective truth is a really interesting question. And I'm not really an expert in the sort of behavioral cognitive science of these things, but it does seem to me that arriving at subjective truth also requires the same kind of step of faith that we use in making a decision. Because I have to be able to make the step that says, okay, I'm going to go with this. I'm going to allow this to change the way that I behave, the things that I do, the places that I go, what I'm going to think. Now, in the particular case of miracles, the subjectivity of the truth is really pointed out by the fact that we could both have exactly the same evidence for something being a miracle. You might think it's a miracle, I might not, because for you it might be really important. Like if it was, for me, I'm more inclined to believe that Peter's healing was a miracle because he's my son. Just being honest, that makes it more significant to me, makes me more likely to think it's a miracle. You don't know him from Adam, and so it's much less likely that you're going to say, yes, miracle. And so the way we ascribe meaning to things is subjective. So different observers will ascribe different kinds of significance to events. But ultimately, the significance and meaning that we ascribe to these things, so I guess that's what I would say, is that ultimately as humans we want this significance and meaning. As a scientist, I don't see a way to that directly through the auspices of science. Religion provides one framework for arriving at meaning and purpose and significance in things. It gives you sort of, doesn't tell you what exactly you should think about these things, but it does provide you a framework for saying, here's the kinds of places that you can look for meaning and the kinds of meaning that other people have found there. There are, of course, other ways that one could go about this in terms of philosophical frameworks that one could take. Does that kind of answer your question? Okay. I feel like that wasn't my best answer, but I tried. So, okay, so I think we have time for one more question. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I was just wondering. Partway through, you said something about how you can have a God without miracles, but you can't have miracles without a God. Did I understand that
Yeah.
correctly? So, if that's true, then does that mean that every time some scientist takes a data set and some of the points are really far off outliers, does that mean that God is like intervening?
No, because again, this is my distinction. I'm like, just because something is irreproducible doesn't make it a miracle. Okay, so I just want to, I said that at some point in the talk. I just want to be clear at the outset here. No one anybody leaving thinking that's what I said. Just because something is irreproducible doesn't make it a miracle. That's just one of the key facets of a miracle. So there's lots of irreproducible stuff that I have a hard time calling a miracle. And just because you say it's irreproducible doesn't mean you're admitting there's a God. So this is the aspect of the definition that says there has to be the significant action of a divine agent. So if there is no divine agent, there is no God, then it's just an irreproducible event and you just throw up your hands. Does that make sense?
So in other words, even if an event is overwhelmingly positive and overwhelmingly good in whatever your perception is, it still might not be a miracle if there wasn't that.
Yeah, if you're not going to ascribe any kind of supernatural intervention, I would say that's just really well, there's a word for that. It's called luck.
Okay.
Right? I got really lucky, and luck is the supernatural without the supernatural kind of thing. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.